The conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the parking garage, which I always thought was a strange design choice for a building that cost $38 million to construct. You'd think someone would have pointed that out before they broke ground. But that's the kind of detail that gets missed when the people making decisions aren't the ones who have to live with them. I sat across from Diane Forsyth with my portfolio binder on the table between us. 47 pages. Performance reviews going back 7 years, client satisfaction scores, project completion timelines, cost-saving initiatives I designed and executed, letters of commendation from 3 separate department heads, and a 2-page summary of every major system I'd built or rebuilt since joining. Callaway Integrated Solutions. I'd spent 11 days putting it together. Color-coded dividers, cross-referenced metrics, the kind of documentation that makes an argument so clearly that the person on the other side doesn't need to say anything, the numbers do the talking. Diane hadn't opened it. She was scrolling through something on her phone with the kind of distracted energy that people project when they've already made a decision and are just waiting for the meeting to be over. "Jessica," she said, setting the phone face down, "I want you to know how much we value everything you contribute here." That sentence is never the beginning of good news. In 7 years of corporate life, and 4 years before that managing logistics for a regional distribution network, I had never once heard that sentence followed by something worth hearing. "We've decided to move Brandon Alcott into the Director of Client Operations role." Brandon Alcott. 26 years old. 8 months at Callaway. Before that, 2 years at a boutique consulting firm where, as far as I could determine, his primary contribution had been preparing slide decks for other people's presentations. He had an MBA from a school with a good basketball program, a firm handshake, and the particular brand of confidence that comes from spending your entire career being told you have potential without ever being asked to demonstrate it in a situation that carried real consequences. I kept my expression even. "I see. We think his energy and fresh perspective are exactly what the department needs going forward. The board is very enthusiastic about the direction he's bringing." The board. I'd met the board exactly twice, both times at holiday functions where I was introduced as one of our operations people, while the people who attended every quarterly meeting without contributing anything operational shook hands and exchanged golf stories. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. Diane looked visibly relieved that I wasn't crying or raising my voice. She picked up her phone again. "Oh, and the Hargrove retail rollout is still on schedule for next Friday, correct?" "Tom Hargrove called me directly this morning, which is a little unusual. I need that transition to go cleanly." I gathered my portfolio binder, stood, and walked out. My name is Jessica Morgan. I'm 44 years old, and for 7 years I was the person who kept Callaway Integrated Solutions client operations from quietly falling apart at every seam. Not the person whose name appeared in the company newsletter when we landed a major contract. Not the person who stood at the front of the room during board presentations, pointing at slides I hadn't made. I was the one who answered emails at 11:30 at night when a client's inventory system threw an error nobody else could diagnose. The one who rebuilt our onboarding process from scratch after the previous director left mid-quarter and took 17 undocumented workflows with her. The one who personally maintained relationships with every major retail client that trusted us to manage their operational transitions. I came to Callaway after my divorce, which was the polite word for what happened when 2 people spend 5 years prioritizing their careers over their marriage until one morning there's nothing left to prioritize. David and I had been good together once. Then we became 2 people sharing an address and a calendar full of conflicts. When it ended, it was quiet and mutual and still gutted me in ways I hadn't expected. My daughter Lily was 9 when we finalized everything. She handled it better than I did, the way kids sometimes absorb enormous things with a practicality that makes adults feel embarrassed about their own processing speed. She wanted to know if she could still have her cat at both houses. I said yes. She nodded and went back to her book. I needed a job that paid well, had real benefits, and didn't require me to travel 4 days a week. Callaway was hiring for a senior operations coordinator, which was 2 levels below what I'd been doing at my previous company, but the benefits package was exceptional, and the office was 12 minutes from Lily's school. I took it. Within 18 months, I'd been promoted to operations manager. Within 3 years, I was functionally running the client operations division while the director at the time, a pleasant man named Robert Keller, spent most of his energy on industry conference panels and left me to handle everything that actually required decisions. When Robert retired, I expected the director role would be mine. I had the tenure, the performance record, the client relationships, and the institutional knowledge that had kept this division functional through 2 software platform migrations, a pandemic-era supply chain collapse, and a 6-month stretch where we were simultaneously onboarding 4 new enterprise clients while managing a billing system overhaul. Instead, they hired Brandon Alcott. The night after Diane's announcement, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without doing anything in particular. Lily was at her father's for the week. The apartment was quiet in the specific way that apartments get quiet when you're used to someone else's noise filling the corners. My mother called around 8. She's 71 and lives in Asheville and has an opinion about everything, which I mean as a genuine compliment. She asked how work was going, and I told her what had happened, and she was quiet for a moment. "So what are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet." "Yes, you do," she said. "You've known since you walked out of that room. You're just deciding whether you're brave enough to do it." My mother has this infuriating habit of being right. I made a decision before I fell asleep. Not an angry one. Not an impulsive one. A calculated one, the kind that comes from sitting very still with a problem until you can see its actual shape clearly. My contract at Callaway specified my role as operations manager. My responsibilities were documented: client communication coordination, internal workflow oversight, cross-departmental reporting, and compliance documentation. That was my job. Everything else, the early morning system checks, the late-night troubleshooting, the undocumented institutional knowledge I carried around in my head like a second operating system, that was what I'd been giving freely for 7 years because I believed it would eventually be recognized. It hadn't been. So I decided to stop giving it for free. I arrived at work the next morning at 8:45. Not 8, not 7:30, not the 6:50 that had become my unofficial start time over the past 3 years. 8:45, which was 15 minutes before my contracted hours began. I made coffee. I settled at my desk. I opened my task management system and reviewed only the items assigned directly to my role. I did not check the shared operations inbox that I had been monitoring voluntarily since the previous director retired. I did not review the overnight client alert logs that I had made a habit of scanning each morning before the rest of the team arrived. I did not pull up the Hargrove Retail staging dashboard to verify the pre-migration checks were running correctly. Those checks existed because I had created them. The documentation existed because I had written it. The runbooks existed because I had authored every single one. If someone else wanted to use them, they were all on the shared drive, organized and indexed. By 10:15, Priya Sundaram appeared at my desk. Priya was our senior client liaison, sharp and capable. someone I'd mentored through her first 2 years at Callaway and who I genuinely liked as a colleague. "Hey, Jess. The Hargrove pre-migration checklist. Did someone already run the morning verification? I'm not seeing it in the log." I looked up from the compliance report I was working on. I didn't run it. That would fall under the director's oversight now. Priya blinked. "Right, but you always," she stopped herself. "Is Brandon handling it? I'd assume so, or whoever he's delegated it to." She stood there for a beat, recalibrating. "Okay, I'll check with him." She walked away. I went back to my report. At 11:30, our IT liaison, Owen Rafferty, stopped by with a look on his face that I recognized as barely controlled alarm. Owen was meticulous, diligent, and possessed of the particular anxiety common to people who understand exactly how many things can go wrong with complex systems and have spent years quietly preventing most of them. "Jessica, the Hargrove staging environment is showing data sync errors on the retail POS integration. It's the same issue we had during the Whitfield grocery rollout. Do you want to jump on it? The actual migration is Friday." "Have you submitted a support ticket?" I asked. "Not yet. I figured you'd just..." "Submit a ticket. Assign it to the appropriate team lead. The resolution steps for POS-sync errors on retail integrations are documented in the operations runbook. Section 8, I believe. The Hargrove-specific configurations are in the client subfolder under their account." Owen stared at me. "The runbook is like 260 pages. It's well indexed," I said. Tab 7 is specifically for retail client integrations. There are step-by-step resolution guides and screenshots for every common failure mode. I wrote it so that any qualified team member could work through these issues independently. He left looking like a man who'd just discovered the safety net he'd been standing on had quietly been rolled up. The ticket sat in the queue until 2 in the afternoon, when a Tier 2 technician named Greg picked it up and spent the next 90 minutes attempting to resolve a configuration issue that I could have walked through in 20 minutes. The staging environment remained unstable. By 4 o'clock, 3 members of the client success team were in the small conference room with their laptops, running diagnostics and comparing notes, a scene that had never once happened during my 7 years because these things had never been allowed to escalate to that point. At exactly 5 o'clock, I saved my work, closed my laptop, and left. I called Lily on the drive home. She was at her dad's, but she picked up immediately, which always made me feel like I'd won something small. "Mom, you never call on Wednesdays. Wanted to hear your voice. How's the science project coming?" She launched into an explanation of the ecosystem model she was building for her 7th grade environmental science class, something involving soil composition and native plant species, and a set of variables she'd designed herself because the assignment parameters were, in her words, too easy. She's 12 and already frustrated by insufficient intellectual challenge, which I find equal parts amusing and deeply relatable. "Mom, you sound weird," she said eventually, with the particular accuracy that children have when they detect something adults are trying to manage. "Weird how? Like you're trying to sound normal." I laughed. "Something happened at work. Nothing dangerous. Just a decision I made. Good decision or bad decision?" "I think it's the right decision. I'll know more in a few days." She considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "Is this about the promotion they didn't give you?" I'd mentioned it briefly, not wanting to make it into something larger than it was. "Dad told you?" "He said you got passed over. He said it wasn't fair. He's probably right. So what are you doing about it?" "I'm letting some silence speak for itself," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like something Grandma would say." "It does," I agreed. "She'd be insufferably pleased about that." When I checked my work phone after we hung up, there were 19 missed calls and 33 unread messages. Thursday morning arrived with the quiet intensity of a situation that had been building pressure all night and was now ready to announce itself. I walked into the Callaway office at 8:45 to find Brandon Alcott standing in the middle of the operations floor with his laptop open and an expression that suggested he was hoping someone would appear and explain to him what was happening. 2 client success managers were on separate calls. Owen was at his standing desk cycling through diagnostic screens. Priya was in the glass-walled office on the phone with what I could tell from the careful neutrality of her posture was a client who was not happy. The Hargrove retail staging environment had been unstable for 36 hours. Their IT director, a methodical man named Clive Barton, had escalated to Diane at 9 the previous evening. Diane had escalated to Brandon. Brandon had suggested they roll back to the previous configuration and start fresh, which would have erased 48 hours of migration preparation work and pushed the Friday launch to an undefined future date, potentially triggering the performance penalty clause in Hargrove's contract. Priya had intercepted that recommendation before it was executed. Barely. I settled at my desk and opened the SOC compliance audit files that were due to the regulatory board by the following Tuesday. Genuine, assigned work. My actual job. Diane appeared at my workstation at 9:15, looking like she'd driven to the office at 6 in the morning, which she probably had. Her usual composed presentation was fraying at the edges, jacket wrinkled, coffee cup already half crushed in her left hand. Jessica, we need to talk about the Hargrove situation. Of course, I said. What's going on? Clive Barton called me personally at 7:30 this morning. They cannot verify the staging data integrity if we can't demonstrate a clean migration environment by end of business today. They have the right to invoke the delay penalty. That's $280,000, Jessica. Per incident. I nodded thoughtfully. That does sound serious. Has Brandon been able to isolate the root cause? Diane's jaw moved in the way it moved when she was choosing words carefully. Brandon is still developing his understanding of the Hargrove account's specific technical requirements. I see. The account history and all the custom configurations are documented in their client subfolder. I can give you the file path if that would help. She looked at me directly. I need you to fix this. I turned my monitor slightly so she could see my screen. I understand the urgency, and I genuinely want to be helpful. But this SOC compliance audit is due to the financial regulators Tuesday morning. Missing that deadline triggers a mandatory review of our data handling practices across every active client account. That's not a Hargrove problem. That's a company-wide problem. The silence that followed had a particular quality. I'd seen that expression on a person's face before, the exact moment when someone realizes that the invisible work they'd been benefiting from wasn't invisible at all. It had just been performed so reliably that they'd stopped accounting for it as something someone was choosing to do. Can't you manage both? She asked. Not without working outside my contracted hours, I said. I've been reflecting on some feedback my daughter gave me about work-life balance. She's been quite direct about it, actually. Diane left without another word. That afternoon, I drove to Lily's school to watch her soccer practice. I hadn't done that in 4 months. There had always been something. A call, a deadline, a crisis that only I had the context to resolve. I sat in the bleachers with a coffee and watched my daughter play defense with the kind of focused aggression that she hadn't inherited from me, but that I admired enormously. Afterward, in the car, she asked me what I'd been doing there. Watching you play, I said. You never come on Thursdays. I'm making some adjustments." She studied me with the particular evaluating look that she'd been deploying since she was about 5, the one where she tilts her head slightly and waits to see if you'll say the true thing or the comfortable thing. Is this related to the silence speaking for itself? It is. She nodded slowly. "Grandma says you used to give too much of yourself to things that didn't give anything back." "When did she say that?" "Last Christmas." She was talking about something else, I think, but it seemed like it applied. I didn't say anything for a moment. "Mom, you always ask about my stuff first," Lily said. "Every time we talk, even when I can tell something happened with you, you always ask about me first. My games, my projects, my school drama. You've done that my whole life." She paused. "I just wanted you to know I notice. My throat tightened in the way it does when something lands before you've had time to prepare for it." "Your grandmother taught me that," I said. "She told me once that the best thing a parent can give is their full attention." "She's usually right," Lily said, with the weary wisdom of someone who'd been on the receiving end of her grandmother's accuracy for 12 years. When I checked my work phone in the parking lot before starting the car, there were 41 missed calls. I turned it face down on the passenger seat and drove home. Friday arrived. I walked in at 8:45 to a building that had the specific atmosphere of a place where a controlled situation had stopped being controlled. People moved quickly and spoke quietly in that way that signals genuine alarm rather than performative urgency. Through the glass walls of the large conference room, I could see Diane, Brandon, 2 people I recognized as senior members of the executive leadership team, and on the large wall monitor, the unmistakable composed expression of Clive Barton, Hargrove's IT director, who had the look of a man who was done being patient. The Hargrove retail migration was supposed to happen that evening. The staging environment had been unstable for 60 hours. Brandon had made 2 additional attempts to resolve the data sync issue using templates he'd downloaded from an industry knowledge base, neither of which accounted for the custom integration architecture I had built specifically for Hargrove's point-of-sale network configuration. The second attempt had inadvertently disrupted the authentication layer between Callaway's operations platform and Hargrove's inventory management system, which meant their QA team had been locked out of the staging environment entirely since 11 o'clock the previous night. I sat at my desk and opened the compliance audit files. Diane's assistant, a precise young man named Felix, who always looked slightly overqualified for his role, appeared at my workstation at 9:20. "Jessica, they're asking for you in the conference room." Emergency meeting. I gathered my notebook and walked in. 6 people turned toward me when I entered. Diane, Brandon, the 2 executive team members, one of whom was Chief Operating Officer Howard Greer, a steady, silver-haired man I respected, and on the monitor, Clive Barton, who was not visibly panicking, which I took as either a good sign or a sign that he'd already made the phone call to. Legal. Howard Greer spoke first. He was the kind of executive who had built things rather than just managed things, and it showed in the way he communicated. Direct, specific, no excess language. "Jessica, thank you for coming in. I'd like you to take a look at what we're dealing with and tell me honestly whether we can salvage the Friday migration." I sat down and looked at Clive on the screen. "Clive, can you walk me through what your team is currently seeing?" Clive Barton outlined the situation with the methodical precision of someone who had been documenting everything since Tuesday. Authentication failures across the staging cluster. Data sync timeouts between the POS integration layer and the inventory management bridge. a secondary error cascade in the compliance logging module that had been introduced by one of Brandon's template applications. I recognized every symptom. I had designed that system. Every custom parameter, every non-standard configuration, every deliberate architecture decision made to accommodate Hargrove's specific retail compliance requirements. It was like hearing someone describe a building I had drawn the blueprints for. That's a compound failure, I said. The pose sync errors are downstream of a memory allocation mismatch in the integration layer. The Hargrove configuration uses a non-standard buffer size specifically designed to handle their peak transaction volume during inventory sweeps. Someone applied a standard industry template over the custom settings, which broke the handshake with the compliance logging module. The authentication lockout is a secondary effect of that initial disruption. Brandon shifted in his chair. The standard template is best practice across the industry. Standard templates work for standard implementations, I said, with the same even tone I would use explaining a process to someone learning it for the first time. Hargrove's integration was purpose-built for their specific retail environment and their compliance reporting requirements. The custom parameters are documented in the Operations Runbook, Section 8, Subsection D, and in the Hargrove Client subfolder under their account. Pages 192 through 219 cover the integration architecture specifically. The conference room produced a particular silence. Howard Greer leaned forward. "Jessica, can you restore the staging environment today?" "Yes," I said, "and I can personally oversee the production migration tonight if we can confirm a clean staging environment by 4 o'clock. What do you need?" 2 hours, Owen Rafferty, and no additional changes to the configuration while I'm working. Howard nodded once. Then he looked at me with the directness of someone who'd been listening carefully and had arrived at a conclusion. "Before we go further, I'd like to understand how we got here. Not to assign blame right now. To understand the gap between what this department needs and what it currently has." The room went quiet again. Differently, I didn't answer immediately. I looked at Brandon, who was staring at the conference table. I looked at Diane, whose expression was somewhere between defensive and resigned. And then I looked at Howard Greer, who was looking at me with the full attention of someone who was actually prepared to hear the answer. "That's a longer conversation," I said. "Can we fix the immediate problem first?" "Agreed," Howard said. "Get the staging environment clean. Then I want to talk." I spent 2 hours in the operations room with Owen, restoring the Hargrove staging environment. The actual technical fix took 55 minutes. The remaining hour and 5 minutes I spent documenting exactly what had failed, creating a simplified quick reference guide for the Hargrove-specific configurations, and walking Owen through the logic of the integration architecture so that he understood not just the solution but the reasoning behind every custom decision. "Why does the buffer size matter that much?" he asked at one point, genuinely curious. "Because Hargrove runs inventory sweeps every 6 hours across 1,100 retail locations simultaneously," I said. "A standard buffer handles maybe 200 transactions per second in peak load. Their sweep cycle spikes to 800 transactions per second for about 45 minutes. If the buffer's too small, the system queues the overflow, which creates latency in the compliance logging module, which triggers false authentication timeouts because the compliance layer interprets a logging delay as a security anomaly." I looked at him. "It's all in Section 8. But now you understand why." He was quiet for a moment. "You designed all of this over about 18 months, starting from a system that was failing Hargrove on a weekly basis when they first came to us." Owen pulled up the documentation on his secondary monitor and started reading. Genuinely reading, not scanning. This is extraordinarily thorough. I wrote it so that someone besides me could run these systems, I said. I just never expected to need to prove that it worked. At 3:50, the staging environment showed clean across every monitoring panel. I sent Clive Barton a verification report. He responded within 4 minutes. Confirmed clean. We're a go for tonight. I'll have my team standing by at 7. The production migration that evening went without a single significant incident. Hargrove's retail systems came up clean, all 1,100 locations synced, compliance logging verified, transaction processing confirmed. At 11:45 p.m., Clive Barton sent an email to Howard Greer noting that the migration had been executed flawlessly and specifically crediting the quality of the integration documentation and the precision of the operational oversight. He didn't mention Brandon. He didn't mention Diane. Howard Greer's office on the top floor had windows that faced the city rather than the parking garage. Small detail, significant difference. He closed the door, poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if I wanted one, set one in front of me, and sat down. "Tell me what happened," he said, "not the technical version, the full version." So I told him. I told it the way I deliver a situation report. Factual, sequential, without emotional inflation or strategic softening. 7 years of arriving before the contracted start time and leaving after the contracted end time. 7 years of maintaining client relationships that the company benefited from but didn't publicly attribute to me. 7 years of building, documenting, training, and quietly absorbing every crisis that might have otherwise become visible to leadership. The promotion announced without conversation. The decision to return for the first time to only what my contract actually required, the 60 hours of cascading consequences that followed. Howard listened without interrupting. He was the kind of listener who doesn't fill the pauses, which I respected. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have known this department better. That's on me. I hadn't expected that." Most executives in his position would have reframed the conversation toward process improvement and organizational learning. He just said it directly. "I appreciate that," I said. "I'm going to be direct with you about what I'd like to do." He set down his coffee. "I want to create a Chief Operations Officer position reporting directly to me. Not through Diane's chain, directly to me. I want you in that role." He named a salary figure that was significantly beyond what I'd expected. Performance bonus structure tied to client retention and operational benchmarks. Full authority over operations staffing, architecture, vendor relationships, and client service standards. I'll also match or exceed any competing offer you may be considering. I held that for a moment. "That's a generous offer," I said. "But compensation isn't the only thing I want to discuss." "What else?" "I want a formal technical career track established for the operations team. There are 8 people on this team who have spent years developing genuine expertise and have no clear path forward that doesn't require them to become managers. Some of them are exceptional at operational execution and would be diminished by management roles. They should have a pathway to senior recognition and compensation that doesn't require them to stop doing the work they're actually excellent at." Howard studied me. "You're negotiating for your team." I watched what happened this week when institutional knowledge walked out the door at 5 o'clock for the first time in 7 years. I have 8 people who each carry pieces of what I carry. If any of them leave because there's no future here for someone who builds and executes rather than manages and presents, this week will look like a minor inconvenience." He was quiet again. "Then, what else?" "Brandon Alcott," I said. Howard raised an eyebrow. "He stays," I said. "He's not ready for the director role he was given, but that's not entirely his fault. He was put in a position that required knowledge and experience he hasn't had the chance to develop yet. If he transitions to a senior operations analyst role under me, with genuine mentoring and structured development, he has the potential to grow into something real. If we let him go, we've just proven that failure is terminal here. That's not the signal you want to send to everyone else watching." Howard leaned back and looked at me with what I recognized, after a beat, as genuine respect. "You could have just asked me to let him go." "I could have," I agreed, "but I've been in enough organizations to know that the culture you build and how you handle failure matters more than any individual decision. I don't want to start this role by demonstrating that the way to get ahead is to make sure other people fall. I'd rather start it by demonstrating that the way to get ahead is to build something that actually works." He stood and extended his hand. "Take the weekend," he said. "Think about the offer. Come back Monday with your answer and whatever conditions you want to formalize. If they're reasonable, I'll sign off." "They'll be reasonable," I said. I drove to see my mother in Asheville that Saturday. I hadn't told her I was coming. She opened the door, looked at me, looked at the overnight bag in my hand, and said I'll make the good pasta without asking a single question. We ate on her back porch in the early evening while the mountains did what mountains do in late spring, which is exist with a completeness that makes everything else feel proportionate. I told her everything. She listened the way she always listens, which is completely, without reorganizing what she's hearing into advice, until she's certain the other person is done speaking. When I finished, she refilled my wine glass and said, "What are you going to do?" "Take the offer," I said. "It's a good offer. And it's the right position. Are you taking it because it's right, or because you proved a point?" I thought about that honestly. "Both," I said. "And I think both are okay." She nodded. "Your father used to say the best decisions are the ones you'd make whether anyone was watching or not. I remember. Did you make this one because you were watching, or because you knew it was right?" I looked at the mountains for a while before I answered. I made it because I'd spent 7 years giving everything I had to something that was treating what I gave as free. And I needed to know if I was right about that. I paused. I was right. She reached over and put her hand on mine. "Good. Now go build something better." We sat there until the light changed and the mountains went from green to blue-gray, the way they do when evening arrives in stages rather than all at once. My mother is not a sentimental person in the conventional sense. She doesn't cry at movies or keep greeting cards, but she has this quality of stillness that she shares with you when she thinks you need it. The kind of stillness that feels less like silence and more like permission to take up. Space. "I was so afraid of looking ungrateful," I said after a while. That was part of it. I kept thinking, I have a good job. I make a decent salary. There are people who would trade everything for what I have. There always are, my mother said. That doesn't make what you have fair. No, I agreed. It doesn't. Gratitude and self-respect aren't opposites, she said. You can be grateful for what you have and still refuse to be taken advantage of. Those two things are allowed to exist at the same time. I'd known that intellectually, but there's a difference between knowing something and being able to stand in it without flinching, and it took my mother saying it plainly on a back porch in Asheville for it to feel like something I was actually allowed to claim. "You're going to be good at this new role," she said. "I know," I said. And for the first time, saying it didn't feel like arrogance. It felt like accuracy. Monday morning, I arrived at 7:15. My choice, not obligation. I stopped by the kitchen, made coffee, stood at the window for a few minutes watching the parking lot fill up, and then walked up to Howard Greer's office. He was already there. "I accept," I said, "with the conditions we discussed." He nodded once, welcome aboard. I spent the rest of that morning meeting individually with each member of my team. Not to announce the transition, but to listen. To ask them what was working, what wasn't, what they needed, what they'd stopped saying because they'd assumed no one would act on it. Owen told me about a monitoring tool he'd wanted to implement for 2 years but couldn't get budget approval for. Priya told me about a client communication process that was generating twice the work it needed to. A junior analyst named Theo, 23 years old and one of the quietest people in the office, told me in a careful, almost apologetic voice about a documentation gap he'd noticed that was creating inconsistency in how we onboarded new retail clients. I listened to all of it. I took notes. I asked follow-up questions. Brandon Alcott came to my office at the end of that first week. He stood in the doorway with the particular posture of someone who is unsure whether they're about to be given good news or dismissed. "You asked them to keep me," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I did." He was quiet. "Why?" "Because you're not incompetent," I said. "You were put in a role that required knowledge you hadn't had the opportunity to develop. That's a management failure, not a character flaw." I looked at him directly. "But if you're going to stay and actually grow here, you're going to have to be willing to be a student for a while. That means asking questions, reading documentation, sitting in on technical reviews, and accepting that the title doesn't give you the knowledge, the work gives you the knowledge." He nodded slowly. I didn't know what I didn't know. "Nobody ever does," I said. "That's why we build documentation." A pause. "I read Section 8, he said. "The Retail Integration Architecture." "Last night." "What did you think?" I didn't understand all of it. He hesitated, but I understood why it was built the way it was. The Hargrove buffer size thing, I would have never caught that from the outside. "Now you would," I said. He thought about that. "Can I ask you questions? When I'm working through something I don't understand?" "That's exactly what I'm here for," I said. 4 months later, the operations team looked and functioned differently. I'd hired a senior operations architect who had been underutilized at a competitor for 3 years, and a client integration specialist with 12 years of retail systems experience who brought technical depth that had previously been a gap. I promoted Owen to lead systems engineer with a compensation band that finally reflected what he actually did. Priya moved into a principal client operations role with her own team of 3. Theo, the quiet junior analyst, had his documentation process improvement implemented company-wide and was put on a fast-track development plan. The technical career track I'd proposed was formally approved by the board. It established 3 distinct advancement pathways: management, technical expertise, and client strategy, with clear milestones and corresponding compensation ranges for each level. 8 people on the team finally had a visible future that matched what they were actually good at. Brandon Alcott surprised everyone, including me. Freed from the performance of a title he hadn't earned the experience to carry, he turned out to be genuinely good at systems thinking when someone took the time to teach him the fundamentals. He had a particular talent for asking the clarifying questions that surfaced hidden assumptions in architectural decisions, the kind of questions that experienced people stop asking because they assume the answers are obvious. Those questions are often the most valuable ones in any room. By month 4, he was leading the documentation review for a new client integration, doing the actual work and doing it with a thoroughness that nobody had expected of him. The Hargrove retail account expanded. Clive Barton brought a proposal to extend our services to their e-commerce platform, citing the quality of the operational transition and the responsiveness of our integration team. Howard Greer sent me a brief email when the contract expansion was signed. It said, "This is what building something well looks like." Thank you. Diane and I reached a functional understanding. She focused on executive relationship management and strategic positioning. I focused on everything operational. We stayed out of each other's lanes, and the division ran more cleanly than it ever had, without the constant invisible labor of one person absorbing every gap and pretending the gaps didn't exist. 6 months after that Monday morning, I left the office at 5:30 on a Friday. Lily was graduating from middle school the following week, a smaller ceremony than it sounds, but she'd been elected to give the student address by her class, which felt like an enormous thing to me, and which she described as honestly kind of embarrassing, but fine. I'd cleared my calendar for the entire week. First real, uncompromised stretch of time I'd taken in years. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. A text from Lily. "Mom, I figured out what I'm going to say. For the speech. I'm going to talk about how the most important thing isn't how smart you are or how hard you work. It's whether you understand which things actually deserve your best effort." I sat in the driver's seat and read that twice. Then I typed back, "That's exactly right." Where did that come from? 3 dots. Then, you, mostly, without knowing you were teaching me. I set the phone on the passenger seat and sat for a while before starting the car. The version of me from 8 months ago would have been in the office until 7:30, watching that text come in on the work phone she kept in her desk drawer, skimming it in the glow of monitoring dashboards before sending a quick love you and returning to whatever crisis had materialized. Between 3 and 5. That version of me thought devotion and availability were the same thing, thought that giving everything I had was the same as being valued, thought that being indispensable was proof of worth. It isn't. Being indispensable just means you've made yourself too easy to take for granted. The more seamlessly you absorb the weight, the more invisible the weight becomes, until the people who benefit from your carrying it have forgotten that the weight exists at all, and forgotten therefore to wonder who's carrying it. The moment I stopped being invisible and started being unavailable, something shifted, not because I withheld out of pettiness, and not because I was proving a point for its own sake, but because silence, when it arrives in the space where effort used to be, has a way of making the shape of that effort suddenly, clearly visible. They saw what they'd been taking for granted, and then they had a choice about what to do with that. But here is the thing that matters more than the title or the salary or the vindication. When I stopped giving every hour to a company that had stopped noticing what those hours cost me, I got those hours back. I spent them on the people who noticed. The phone calls with Lily that I'd been ending too early because something was always pending. The Saturday mornings at my mother's table that I'd been skipping because there was always one more email. The simple act of sitting in the bleachers at a Thursday soccer practice and watching my daughter play defense like she was protecting something worth protecting. The most powerful thing I did in those 8 months wasn't solving the Hargrove crisis, though I solved it. It wasn't negotiating a title or a salary or a team structure, though I negotiated all of those things. The most powerful thing I did was smaller and quieter than any of that. I stopped. I let the silence arrive. I paid attention to what it revealed, and then I went back. Not because I'd been given back what I deserved, though I had been, but because I finally understood the terms. Sometimes the most important boundary you will ever draw is the one that reveals for the first time exactly where you end and where you've been allowing someone else to begin. The work still matters. Doing it well still matters. Bringing everything you genuinely have to the things that deserve it, that still matters more than anything. Just make sure the things you're giving it to have earned it, and make sure the people who actually see you, the ones who notice when you sound different on the phone, who remember to ask about your day before they start talking about theirs, who text you their best ideas because they know you'll understand why those ideas matter, make sure they're getting the best of what you have to offer, because when the time comes, those are the people who remind you that showing up for them was never a sacrifice. It was the whole point.